Section 21 of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 21. My car leaped forward and I headed along the outside road toward the nearby highway. Through the busted gate I roared, past the downed guard and the smashed guardhouse, past the wreck of Farrow's car. But Nurse Farrow was not finished with this gambit yet. As I drew even with her, she pried herself out of the messy tangle and came across the field in a dead run. And how that girl could run! As fast as I was going, she caught up. As fast as it all happened, I had too little time to slow me down before Nurse Farrow closed the intervening distance from her wreck to my car and had hooked her arm in through one open window. My car lurched with the impact, but I fought the wheel straight again and Farrow snapped, "Keep going, Steve." I kept going. Farrow snaked herself inside and flopped into the seat beside me. "Now," she said, patting the dashboard of our car. "It's up to the both of us now. Don't talk, Steve, just drive like crazy." "Where?" She laughed a weak little chuckle. "Anywhere, so long as it's a long, long way from here." I nodded and settled down to some fancy mile-getting. Farrow relaxed in the seat, opened the glove compartment, and took out a first aid kit. It was only then I noticed that she was banged up quite a bit for a Mextrum. I'd not been too surprised when she emerged from the wreck. I'd become used to the idea of the indestructibility of the Mextrum. I was a bit surprised at her being banged up. I'd become so used to their damage-proof hide that the idea of minor cuts, scars, mars, and abrasions hadn't occurred to me. Yes, that wreck would have mangled a normal man into an unrecognizable mess of hamburger, yet I'd expected a Mextrum to come through it unscathed. On the other hand, the damage to Farrow's body was really minor. She bled from a long gash on her thigh, from a wound on her right arm, and from a myriad of little cuts on her face, neck, and shoulders. So as I drove crazy fast away from the medical center, Nurse Farrow relaxed in the seat and applied adhesive tape, compresses, and closed the gashes with a batch of little skin clips in lieu of sutures. Then she lit 2 cigarettes and handed one of them to me. "Okay now, Steve," she said easily. "Let's drive a little less crazily." I pulled the car down to a flat 100 and felt the strain go out of me. "As I remember, there's one of the highways not far from here." She shook her head. "No, Steve, we don't want the highways in hiding either." At a mere 100 per, I could let my Esper do the road sighting, so I looked over at her. She was half smiling, but beneath the little smile was a firm look of self-confidence. "No," she said quietly, "we don't want the highways. If we go there, Phelps and his outfit will turn heaven and earth to break it up, now that you've become so important. You forget that the medical center is still being run to look legal and above board, while the highways are still in hiding. Phelps could make quite a bitter case out of their reluctance to come out into the open." "Well, where do we go?" I asked. "West," she said simply. "West into New Mexico, to my home." This sort of startled me. Somehow I'd not connected Farrow with any permanent home. As a nurse, and later as one of the medical center, I'd come to think of her as having no permanent home of her own. Yet, like the rest of us, Nurse Farrow had been brought up in a home with a mother and a father and probably some sisters and brothers. Mine were dead and the original home disbanded, but there was no reason why I should think of everybody else in the same terms. After all, Catherine had had a mother and a father who'd come to see me after her disappearance. So we went west, across southern Illinois and over the big bridge at St. Louis into Missouri, and across Missouri and west, west, west. We parked nights in small motels, and took turns sleeping, with one of us always awake and alert, with esper and telepath senses geared high for the first sight of any threat. We gave the highways we came upon a wide berth. At no time did we come close to any of their way stations. It made our path crooked and much longer than it might have been if we'd strung a line and gone. But eventually we ended up in a small town in New Mexico and at a small ranch house on the edge of town. It is nice to have parents. I missed my own deeply when I was reminded of the sweet wonder of having people just plain glad to see their children again, no matter what they'd done, under any circumstances. Even bringing a semi-invalid into their homes for an extended course of treatment. John Farrow was a tall man with gray at the temples and a pair of sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. He was a fair perceptive who might have been quite proficient if he had taken the full psi course at some university. Mrs. Farrow was the kind of elderly woman that any man would like to have for a mother. She was sweet and gentle, but there was neither foolish softness or fatuous nonsense about her. She was a telepath, and she knew her way around and let people know that she knew what the score was. Farrow had a brother, James, who was not at home. He lived in town with his wife, but came out to the old homestead about once every week on some errand or other. They took me in as though I'd come home with their daughter for sentimental reasons. Gloria sat with us in their living room and went through the whole story, interrupted now and then by a remark aimed at me. They inspected my hand and agreed that something must be done. They were extremely interested in the Mextrom problem and were amazed at their daughter's feats of strength and endurance. My hand, by this time, was beginning to throb again. The infection was heading on a fine start down the pinky and middle fingers. The ring finger was approaching the second joint to that point where the advance stopped long enough for the infection to become complete before it crossed the joint. The first waves of that particular pain were coming at intervals, and I knew that within a few hours the pain would become waves of agony so deep that I would not be able to stand it. Ultimately, Farrow got her brother James to come out from town with his tools, and between us all we rigged up a small manipulator for my hand. Farrow performed the medical operations from the kit in the back of the car we'd stolen from the medical center. Then, after they'd put my hand through the next phase, Nurse Farrow looked me over and gave the opinion that it was now approaching the time for me to get the rest of the full treatment. One evening I went to bed, to be in bed for 4 solid months. I'd like to be able to give a blow-by-blow description of those 4 solid months. Unfortunately, I was under dope so much of the time that I know little about it. It was not pleasant. My arm laid like a log from the petrified forest, strapped into the machine that moved the joints with regular motion, and with each motion starting a dart of fire and mangling pain up to the shoulder. Needles entered the veins at the elbow and the armpit, and from bottles suspended almost to the ceiling to provide a pressure head, plasma and blood sustenance was trickled in to keep the arm alive. Dimly, I recall having the other arm strapped down and the waves of pain that blasted at me from both sides. The only way I kept from going out of my mind with the pain was living from hypo to hypo and waiting for the blessed blackness that wiped out the agony, only to come out of it hours later with my infection advanced to another point of pain. When the infection reached my right shoulder, it stopped for a long time. The infection rose up my left arm and also stopped at the shoulder. I came out of the dope to find James and his father fitting one of the manipulators to my right leg, and through that I could feel the darting pains in my calf and thigh. At those few times when my mind was clear enough to let me use my perception, I dug the room and found that I was lying in a veritable forest of bottles and rubber tubes and a swathe of bandages. Utterly helpless, I vaguely knew that I was being cared for in every way. The periods of clarity were fewer now and shorter when they came. I awoke once to find my throat paralyzed, and again to find that my jaw, tongue, and lower face was a solid pincushion of darting needles of fire. Later, my ears reported not a sound, and even later still I awoke to find myself strapped into a portable resuscitator that moved my chest up and down with an inexorable force. That's about all I know of it. When the smoke cleared away completely and the veil across my eyes was gone, it was spring outside, and I was a mextrum. I sat up in bed. It was morning. The sun was streaming in the window brightly, and the fresh morning air of spring stirred the curtains gently. It was quite warm, and the smell that came in from the outside was alive with newborn greenery. It felt good just to be alive. The hanging bottles and festoons of rubber hose were gone. The crude manipulators had been stowed somewhere, and the bottles of medicine and stuff were missing from the bureau. There wasn't even a thermometer and a glass anywhere within the range of my vision, and frankly, I was so glad to be alive again that I did not see any point to digging through the joint with my perception to find the location of the medical junk. Instead, I just wanted to get up and run. I did take a swing at the clothes closet and found my stuff. Then I took a mild pass at the house, located the bathroom, and also assured myself that no one was likely to interrupt me. I was going to shave and shower and dress and go downstairs. I was just shrugging myself up and out of bed when Nurse Farrow came bustling up the stairs and into the room with no preamble. "Hi," I greeted her. "I was going to—" "Surprise us," she said quickly. "I know. So I came up to see that you don't get into trouble." "Trouble?" I asked, pausing on the edge of the bed. "You're a mextrum, Steve," she told me unnecessarily. Then she caught my thought and went on, "It's necessary to remind you. You have to learn how to control your strength, Steve." I flexed my arms. They didn't feel any different. I pinched my muscle with my other hand, and it pinched just as it always had. I took a deep breath, and the air went in pleasantly and came out again. "I don't feel any different," I told her. She smiled and handed me a common wooden lead pencil. "Write your name," she directed. "Think I'll have to learn all over?" I grinned. I took the pencil, put my fist down on the top of the bureau above a pad of paper, and chuckled at Farrow. "Now, let's see. My first initial is the letter S, made by starting at the top and coming around in a sweeping, graceful curve like this." It didn't come around in any curve. As the lead point hit the paper, it bore down in, flicked off the tip, and then crunched down, breaking off the point and splintering the thin whittled wood for about 1/8 of an inch. The fact that I could not control it bothered me inside, and I instinctively clutched at the shaft of the pencil. It cracked in 3 places in my hand. The top end with the eraser fell down over my wrist to the bureau top and rolled in a rapid rattle to the edge, where it fell to the floor. "See?" asked Farrow softly. "But," I blundered uncertainly. "Steve, your muscles and your nervous system have been stepped up proportionately. You've got to relearn the coordination between the muscle stimulus and the feedback information from the work you are doing." I began to see what she meant. I remembered long years ago at school when we'd been studying some new alloy and there had been a sample of a magnesium-lithium-something alloy that was machined into a smooth cylinder about 4 inches in diameter and a foot long. It looked like hard steel. People who picked it up for the first time invariably braced their muscles and set both hands on it, but it was so light that their initial effort almost tossed the bar through the ceiling. And even long after we all knew, it was hard not to attack the bar without using the experience of our mind and sense that told us that any bar of metal that big had to be that heavy. I went to a chair. Farrow said, "Be careful," and I was. but it was no trick at all to take the chair by one leg at the bottom and lift it chin high. "Now go take your shower," she told me. "But Steve, please be careful of the plumbing. You can twist off the faucet handles, you know." I nodded and turned to her, holding out a hand. "Pharaoh, you're a brick." She took my hand. It was not steel hard. It was warm and firm and pleasant. It was holding hands with a woman. Pharaoh stepped back. "One thing you'll have to remember," she said cheerfully, "is to only mix with your own kind from now on. Now go get that shower and shave. I'll be getting breakfast." Showering was not hard, and I remembered not to twist off the water tap handles. Shaving was easy, although I had to change razor blades 3 times in the process. I broke all the teeth out of the comb because it was never intended to be pulled through a thicket of piano wire. Getting dressed was something else. I caught my heel in one trouser leg and shredded the cloth. I broke the buckle on my belt. My shoelaces went like parting a length of wet spaghetti. The button on the top of my shirt pinched off, and when I gave that final jerk to my necktie, it pulled the knot into something about the size of a pea. Breakfast was very pleasant, although I bent the fork tine, spearing a rasher of bacon, and removed the handle of my coffee cup without half trying. After breakfast, I discovered that I could not remove a cigarette from the package without pinching the end down flat, and after I succeeded in getting one into my mouth by treating both smoke and match as if they were made of tissue paper, my first drag on the smoke lit a howling furnace fire on the end that consumed half of the cigarette in the first puff. "You're going to take some school before you are fit to walk among normal people, Steve," said Gloria with amused interest. "You're informing me?" I asked with some dismay, eyeing the wreckage left in my wake. Compared to the new Steve Cornell, the famous bull in the china shop was gentle Ferdinand. I picked up the cigarette package again. It squoze down even though I tried to treat it gentle. I felt like Lenny pinching the head off of the mouse. I also felt about as much of a bumbling idiot as Lenny, too. My re-education went on before, through, and after breakfast. I manhandled old books from the attic. I shredded newspapers. I ruined some more lead pencils and finally broke the pencil sharpener to boot. I put an elbow through the middle panel of the kitchen door without even feeling it, and then managed to twist off the doorknob. Generally operating like a one-man army of vandals, I laid waste to the Pharaoh home. Having thus ruined a nice house, Gloria decided to try my strength on her car. I was much too fast and too hard on the brakes, which of course was not too bad because my foot was also too insensitive on the go pedal. We took off like a rocket being launched, and then I tromped on the brakes, bending the pedal, which brought us down sharp like hitting a haystack. This allowed our heads to catch up with the rest of us. I'm sure that if we'd been normal-bodied human beings, we'd have had our spines snapped. Eventually, I learned that everything had to be handled as if it were tissue paper, and gradually readjusted my reflexes to take proper cognizance of the feedback data according to my new body. We returned home after a hectic 20 miles of road work, and I broke the glass as I slammed the car door. "It's going to take time," I admitted with some reluctance. "It always does," smiled Pharaoh as cheerfully as if I hadn't ruined their possessions. "I don't know how I'm going to face your folks." Pharaoh's smile became cryptic. "Maybe they won't notice." "Now look, Pharaoh." "Steve, don't forget for the moment that you're the only known Mextrum carrier." "In other words, your parents are due for the treatment next?" "Oh, I was most thorough. Both of them are in the final stages right now. I'm sure that anything you did to the joint will only be added to by the time they get to the walking stage. And also anything you did they'll feel well repaid." I didn't do anything for them.
You provided them with Mekstrom bodies,
She said simply. They took to it willingly?
yes. As soon as they were convinced by watching me and my strength, they knew what it would be like, but they were all for it.
You've been a very busy girl, I told her. She just nodded. Then she looked up at me with troubled eyes and asked,
What are you going to do now, Steve?
I'm going to haul the whole shebang down like Samson in the temple.
A lot of innocent people are going to get hurt if you do that.
I can't very well find a cave in Antarctica and hide, I replied glumly.
Think a bit, Steve. Could either side afford to let you walk into New Washington with the living proof of your Mekstrom body?
Didn't stop 'em before, I thought angrily. And it seems to me that both sides were sort of urging me to go and do something that would uncover the other side.
Not deep enough, said Pharaoh. That was only during the early phases. Go back to the day when you didn't know what was going on.
I grunted sourly. Look, Pharaoh, tell me. Why must I fumble my way through this as I've fumbled through everything else?
Because only by coming to the conclusion in your own way will you be convinced that someone isn't lying to you. Now think it over, Steve.
It made sense. Even if I came to the wrong conclusion, I'd believe it more than if someone had told me. Pharaoh nodded, following my thoughts. Then I plunged in. First, we have a man who is found to be a carrier of Mekstrom's disease. He doesn't know anything about the disease, right? Pharaoh nodded slowly. So now the medical center puts an anchor onto their carrier by sicking an attractive dame on his trail. At this point, I went into a bit of a mental whirly-around, trying to find an answer to one of the puzzlers. Pharaoh just looked at me with a non-leading expression, waiting. I came out of the merry-go-round after 6 times around the circuit and went on. I don't know all the factors. Obviously, Catherine had to lead me fast, because we had to marry before she contracted the disease from me. But there's a discrepancy, Pharaoh. The little blonde receptionist caught it in 24 hours.
Steve, said Pharaoh, this is one I'll have to explain since you're not a medical person. The period of incubation depends upon the type of contact. You actually bit the receptionist. That put blood contact into it. You didn't draw any blood from Catherine.
We were pretty close, I said, with a slight reddening of the ears.
From a medical standpoint, you were not much closer to Catherine than you have been to me or Dr. Thorndyke. You were closer to Thorndyke and me, say, than you've been to many of the incidental parties along the path of our travels.
Well, let that angle go for the moment. Anyway, Catherine and I had to marry before the initial traces were evident. Then I'd be in the position of a man whose wife had contracted Mekstrom's disease on our honeymoon, whereupon the medical center would step in and cure her, and I'd be in the position of being forever grateful and willing to do anything that the medical center wanted me to do. As a poor non-telepath, I'd probably never learn the truth. Right?
So far,
she said, still in a non-committal tone. So now we crack up along the highway near the Harrison place. The highways take her in because they take any victim in no matter what. I also presume from what's gone on that Catherine is a high enough telepath to conceal her thinking and so to become an undercover agent in the midst of the highways organization. And at this point, the long, long trail takes a fork, doesn't it? The medical center gang did not know about the highways in hiding until Catherine and I barreled into it end over end. Pharaoh's face softened, and although she said nothing, I knew I was on the right track. So at this point, I went on silently,
medical center found themselves in a mild quandary. They could hardly put another woman on my trail because I was already emotionally involved with the missing Catherine, and so they decided to use me in another way. I was shown enough to keep me busy. I was more or less urged to go track down the highways in hiding for the medical center. After all, as soon as I'd made the initial discovery, Phelps and his outfit shouldn't have needed any more help.
A bit more thinking, Steve. You've come up with that answer before.
Sure. Phelps wanted me to take my tale to the government about this secret highway outfit. But if neither side can afford to have the secret come out, how come?
I pondered this for a long time and admitted that it made no sense to me. Finally, Farrow shook her head and said,
Steve, I've got to prompt you now and then, but remember that I'm trying to make you think it out yourself. Now consider, you are running an organization that must be kept secret. Then someone learns the secret and starts heading for the authorities. What is your next move?
Okay, I replied, so I'm stupid. Naturally, I pull in my horns, hide my signs, and make like nothing was going on.
So stopping the advance of your organization, which is all that Phelps really can expect.
I thought some more.
And the fact that I was carrying a story that would get me popped into the nearest hatch for the incipient paranoid made it all right?
She nodded.
And now?
She asked me. And now I'm living proof of my story. Is that right?
Right. And Steve, do not forget for one moment that the only reason you're still alive is because you are valuable to both sides alive. Dead, you're only good for a small quantity of Mextrum inoculation.
Don't follow, I grunted. As you say, I'm no medical person.
Alive, your hair grows and must be cut. You shave and trim off beard. Your fingernails are pared. Now and then you lose a small bit of hide or a few milliliters of blood. These are things that, when injected under the skin of a normal human, makes them Mextrum. Dead, your ground-up body would not provide much substance.
Pleasant prospect, I growled. So what do I do to avert this future?
Steve, I don't know. I've done what I can for you. I've effected the cure and I've done it in safety. You're still Steve Cornell.
End of chapter 21. Section 22 of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 22. Look, I blurted with a sudden rush of brain to the head. If I'm so all-fired important to both sides, how come you managed to sequester me for 4 months?
We do have laws of privacy, said Farrow simply, which neither side can afford to flout overtly. Furthermore, since neither side really knew where you were, they've been busily prowling one another's camps and locking up the prowlers from one another's camps and playing spy and counter-spy and counter-counter-spy and generally piling it up pyramid-wise, she finished with a chuckle. You got away with following that letter to Catherine because uppermost in your mind was the brain of a lover hunting down his missing sweetheart. No one could go looking for Steve Cornell, Mextrum carrier, for reasons not intrinsically private. For 4 months? I asked, still incredulous. Well, one of the angles is that both sides knew you were immobilized somewhere going through this cure. Having you a full Mextrum is something that both sides want, so they've been willing to have you cured. So long as someone does the work, huh? Right,
she said seriously. Well then, I said with a grim smile, The obvious thing for me to do is to slink quietly into New Washington and to seek out some high official in secrecy. I'll put my story and facts into his hands, make him a mextrum, have him cured, and then we'll set up an agency to provide the general public with—
Steve, you're an engineer. I presume you've studied mathematics? So let's assume that you can, bite one person every 10 seconds.
That's 6 persons per minute, 360 per hour, and 8640 per day. With 160 million Americans at the last census, 60 years without sleep, I see what you mean.
Not only that, Steve, but it would create a panic, if not a global war. Make an announcement like that, and certain of our not-too-friendly neighbors would demand their shares or else. So now add up your time to take care of about 3 billion human souls on this earth, Steve.
All right, so I'll forget that cockeyed notion. But still, the government should know.
If we could be absolutely certain that every elected official is a sensible, honest man, we could, said Pharaoh. The trouble is that we've got enough demagogues, publicity hounds, and rabble-rousers to make the secret impossible to keep.
I couldn't argue against that. Pharaoh was right. Not only that, but government found it hard enough to function in this world of Rhine Institute with honest secrets. Okay, then, I said. The only thing to do is to go back to Homestead, Texas, throw my aid to the highways in hiding, and see what we can do to provide the Earth with some more sensible method of inoculation. I obviously cannot go around biting people for the rest of my life.
I guess that's it, Steve.
I looked at her. I'll have to borrow your car.
It's yours.
You'll be all right? She nodded.
Eventually, I'll be a way station on the highways, I suppose. Can you make it alone, Steve? Or would you rather wait until my parents are cured? You could still use a telepath, you know.
Think it's safe for me to wait?
It's been 4 months. Another week or two?
All right. And in the meantime, I'll practice getting along with this new body of mine. We left it there. I roamed the house with Pharaoh, helping her with her parents. I gradually learned how to control the power of my new muscles, learned how to walk among normal people without causing their attention, and one day succeeded in shaking hands with a storekeeper without giving away my secret. Eventually, Nurse Pharaoh's parents came out of their treatment, and we spent another couple of days with them. We left them too soon, I'm sure, but they seemed willing that we take off. They'd set up a telephone system for getting supplies so that they'd not have to go into town until they learned how to handle their bodies properly, and Pharaoh admitted that there was little more that we could do. So we took off because we all knew that time was running out. Even though both sides had left us alone while I was immobilized, both sides must have had a timetable good enough to predict my eventual cure. In fact, as I think about it now, both sides must have been waiting along the outer edges of some theoretical area waiting for me to emerge, since they couldn't come plowing in without giving away their purpose. So we left in Pharaoh's car and once more hit the big broad road. We drove towards Texas until we came upon a highway and then turned along it looking for a way station. I wanted to get in touch with the highways. I wanted close communication with the Harrisons and the rest of them no matter what. Eventually, we came upon a sign with the missing spoke and turned in. The side road wound in and out, leading us back from the highway towards the conventional dead area. The house was a white structure among a light thicket of trees, and as we came close to it, we met a man busily tilling the soil with a tractor plow. Pharaoh stopped her car. I leaned out and started to call, but something stopped me.
"He is no Mextrum, Steve,"
said Pharaoh in a whisper. But this is a way station according to the road sign.
I know, but it isn't according to him. He doesn't know any more about Mextrum's disease than you did before you met Catherine.
Then what the devil is wrong?
I don't know. He's a perceptive but not too well trained. Name's William Carroll. Let me do the talking. I'll drop leading remarks for you to pick up."
The man came over amiably. "Looking for someone?" he asked cheerfully.
"Why, yes," said Gloria. "We're sort of mildly acquainted with the Mannheims who used to live here. Sort of friends of theirs. Just dropped by to say hello, sort of,"
she went on, covering up the fact that she'd picked the name of the former occupant out of his mind. "Oh, the Mannheims moved about 2 months ago," he said. "Sold the place to us. We got a bargain. Don't really know, of course, but the story is that one of them had to move for his health."
"Too bad. Know where they went?"
"No," said Carol regretfully. "They seem to have a lot of friends, always stopping by, but I can't help 'em any."
"So they moved so fast that they couldn't even change their highway sign,"
I thought worriedly. Farrow nodded at me almost imperceptibly. Then she said to Carol,
"Well, we won't keep you. Too bad the Mannheims moved without leaving an address."
"Yeah," he said with obvious semi-interest. He eyed his half-plowed field, and Farrow started her car. We started off, and he turned to go back to his work. "Anything?" I asked.
"No,"
she said, but it was a very puzzled voice.
"Nothing that I can put a finger on."
"But what?"
"I don't know much about real estate deals," she said. "I suppose that one family could move out and another family could move in just in this short a time."
"Usually they don't let farmlands lie fallow," I pointed out. "If there's anything off color here, it's the fact that they changed their residence without changing the highway sign. Unless," I suggested brightly, "this is the coincidence. Maybe this sign is really one that got busted." Farrow turned her car into the main highway, and we went along it. I could have been right about the spoke actually being broken instead of removed for its directing purpose. I hoped so. In fact, I hoped so hard that I was almost willing to forget the other bits of evidence. But then I had to face the truth, because we passed another highway sign, and, of course, its directional information pointed to that farm. The signs on our side of the highway were upside down, indicating that we were leaving the way station. The ones that were posted on the left-hand side were right side up, indicating that the drive was approaching a way station. That cinched it.
"Well,"
as I told both Farrow and me,
"one error doesn't create a trend. Let's take another look."
One thing and another, we would either hit another way station before we got to Homestead, or we wouldn't. Either one could put us wise. So we took off again with determination and finally left that side of the erroneous highway signs when we turned onto Route 66. We weren't on Route 66 very long because the famous U.S. highway sort of trends to the northeast, and Homestead was in a southern portion of Texas. We left Route 66 at Amarillo and picked up US 87, which leads due south. Not many miles out of Amarillo, we came upon another set of highway signs that pointed us on to the south. I tried to remember whether this section led to Homestead by a long route, but I hadn't paid too much attention to the maps when I'd had the chance, and therefore the facts eluded me. We'd find out, Farrow and I agreed, and then, before we could think much more about it, we came upon a way station sign that pointed into another farmhouse. "Easy," I said.
"You bet,"
she replied, pointing to the rural-type mailbox alongside the road. I nodded. The box was not new, but the lettering on the side was. "Still wet," I said with a grunt. Farrow slowed her car as we approached the house, and I leaned out and gave a cheerful hail. A woman came out of the front door and waved at us. "I'm trying to locate a family named Harrison," I called. "Lived around here somewhere?" The woman looked thoughtful. She was maybe 35 or so, clean but not company-dressed. There was a smudge of flour on her cheek and a smile on her face, and she looked wholesome and honest. Why, I don't really know, she said. That name sounds familiar, but it is not an uncommon name. I know, I said uselessly. Pharaoh nudged me on the ankle with her toe and then made a swift sign for P in the hand sign code. Why don't you come on in? Invited the woman. We've got an area telephone directory here. Maybe... Pharaoh nudged me once more and made the sign of M with her swift fingers. We had hit it this time. Here was a woman perceptive and a mextrum residing in a way station. I took a mild dig at her hands, and there was no doubt of her. A man's head appeared in the doorway above the woman. He had a hard face, and he was tall and broad-shouldered, but there was a smile on his face that spread around the pipe he was biting on. He called, "Come on in and take a look." Pharaoh made the sign of T and M, and that told me that he was a telepath. She hadn't needed the M sign because I'd taken a fast glimpse of his hide as soon as he appeared. Parrying for time and something evidential, I merely said, "No, we'd hate to intrude. We were just asking." The man said, "Aw, shucks, mister. Come on in and have a cup of coffee anyway." His invitation was swift enough to set me on edge. I turned my perception away from him and took a fast cast at the surrounding territory. There was a mildly dead area along the lead-in road to the left. It curved around in a large arc, and the other horn of this horseshoe shape came up behind the house and stopped abruptly just inside of their front door. The density of this area varied, and the end in which the house was built was so total that I couldn't penetrate, while the other end that curved around to end by the road tapered off in deadness until it was hard to define the boundary. If someone were pulling a flanking movement around through that horseshoe to cut off our retreat, it would become evident very soon. A swift thought went through my mind. "Pharaoh, they're mextrums, and he's a telepath, and she's a perceptive, and they know we're friendly if they're highways, if they're connected with Scholar Phelps and his..." The man repeated, "Come on in. We've some mail to go to Homestead that you can take if you will." Pharaoh made no sound. She just seesawed her car with 3 rapid back-and-forth jerks that sent showers of stones from her spinning wheels. We whined around in a curve that careened the car up on its outside wheels. Then we ironed out and showered the face of the man with stones from the wheels as we took off. The shower of dust and stones blinded him and kept him from latching onto the tail of the car and climbing in. We left him behind, swearing and rubbing dirt from his eyes. We whipped past the other end of the horseshoe area just as a jeepster came roaring down out of the thickened part into the region where my perception could make out the important things, like 3 burly gents wearing hunting rifles, for instance. They jounced over the rough ground and onto the lead-in road just behind us. Another few seconds of gab with our friends and they'd have been able to cut us off. "Pour it on, Pharaoh." I knew I was a bit of a cowboy, but Pharaoh made me look like a tenderfoot. We rocketed down the winding road with our wheels riding up on either side like the course in a toboggan run, and Pharaoh rode that car like a test pilot in a sudden thunderstorm. I was worried about the hunting rifles, but I need not have been concerned. We were going too fast to make good aim, and their jeepster was not a vehicle known for its smooth riding qualities. They lost one character over a rough bounce, and he went tail over scalp into the grass along the way. He scared me by leaping to his feet, grabbing the rifle, and throwing it up to aim. But before he could squeeze off a round, we were out of the lead-in road and on the broad highway. Once on the main road again, Pharaoh put the car hard down by the nose, and we outran them. The jeepster was a workhorse and could have either pulled over the house or climbed the wall and run along the roof, but it was not made for chase. "That," I said, "seems to be that."
"Something is bad," agreed Pharaoh.
"Well, I doubt that they'll be able to clean out a place as big as Homestead. So let's take our careful route to Homestead and find out precisely what the devil is cooking."
"Know the route?"
"No, but I know where it is on the map, and we can figure it out from—"
"Steve, stop! Take a very careful and delicate view over to the right.
Digging for what?
Another car pacing us along a road on the other side of that field.
I tried and failed. Then I leaned back in the seat and closed my eyes and tried again. On this second try, I got a very hazy perception of a large moving mass that could only have been a car. In the car, I received a stronger impression of weapons. It was the latter that cinched it. I hauled out my road map and turned it to Texas. I thumbed the sectional maps of Texas until I located the sub-district through which we were passing, and then I identified this section of US 87 precisely. There was another road parallel and a half a mile to the right, a dirt road according to the map legend. It intersected our road a few miles ahead. My next was a thorough covering of the road behind. As I expected, another car was pacing us just beyond the range of my perception for anything but a rifle aimed at my hide. Pacing isn't quite the word. I use it in the sense of they are keeping up with us. Fact is that all of us were going about as fast as we could go, with safety of tertiary importance. Anyway, they were pacing us and closing down from that parallel road on the right. I took a fast and very careful scanning of the landscape to our left, but couldn't find anything. I spent some time at it then, but still came up with a blank.
Turn left at that feeder road a mile ahead,
I thought at Faro, and she nodded. There was one possibility that I did not like to face. We had definitely detected pursuit to our right and behind, but not to our left. This did not mean that the left side was not covered. It was quite likely that the gang to the rear were in telepathic touch with a network of other telepaths, the end of which mental relay link was far beyond range, but as close in touch with our position and action as if we'd been in sight. The police make stakeout nets that way, but the idea is not exclusive. I recall hazing an eloping couple that way once. But there was nothing to do but to take the feeder road to the left, because the devil we could see was more dangerous than the devil we couldn't. Faro whipped into the side road and we tore along with only a slight slowing of our headlong speed. I ranged ahead, worried, suspicious of everything, scanning very carefully and strictly on the watch for any evidence of attempted interception. I caught a touch of danger converging up from the south on a series of small roads. This I did not consider dangerous after a fast look at my road map, because this series of roads did not meet our side road for a long time and only after a lot of turning and twisting. So long as we went easterly, we were okay from that angle. The gang behind, of course, followed us, staying at the very edge of my range. "You'll have to fly, Faro," I told her. "If that gang to our south stays there, we'll not be able to turn down Homestead Way."
Steve, I'm holding this crate on the road by main force and awkwardness as it is.
But she did step it up a bit at that. I kept a cautious and suspicious watch out, worrying in the back of my mind that someone among them might turn up with a jet copter. So long as the sky remained clear. As time went on, I perceived that the converging car to the south was losing ground because of the convolutions of their road. Accordingly, we turned to the south, making our way around their nose, sort of, and crossing their anticipated course to lead south. We hit US 180 to the west of Breckenridge, Texas, and then Faro really poured on the coal. The idea was to hit Fort Worth and lose them in the city where fun, games, and telepath-perceptive hare and hounds would be viewed dimly by the peace-loving citizens. Then we'd slope to the south on US 81, cut over to US 75 somewhere to the south, and take 75 like a cannonball until we turned off on the familiar road to Homestead. Fort Worth was a haven and a detriment to both sides. Neither of us could afford to run afoul of the law, so we both cut down to sensible speeds and snaked our way through the town, with Faro and me probing roads to the south in hope of finding a clear lane. There were 3 cars pacing us, cutting off our retreat southward. They hazed us forward to the east like a dog nosing a bunch of sheep towards Pappy's barn. Then we were out of Fort Worth and on US 180. We whipped into Dallas and tried the same circumfusion as before, and we were as neatly barred. So we went out of Dallas on US 67, and as we left the city limits, we poured on the oil again, hoping to get around them so that we could turn back south towards Homestead. "Boxed," I said. "Looks like it," said Farrow unhappily. I looked at her. She was showing signs of weariness, and I realized that she'd been riding this road for hours. "Let me take it," I said.
"We need your perception," she objected. "You can't drive and keep arranging perception, Steve."
"A lot of good arranging perception will do once you drop for lack of sleep and we tie us up in a ditch."
"But—"
"We're boxed," I told her. "We're being hazed. Let's face it, Farrow. They could have surrounded us and glommed us any time in the past 6 hours."
"Why didn't they?"
she asked. "You ask that because you're tired," I said with a grim smile. "Any bunch that has enough cars to throw a barrier along the streets of cities like Fort Worth and Dallas have enough manpower to catch us if they want to. So long as we drive where they want us to go, they won't cramp us down."
"I hate to admit it."
"So do I. But let's swap, Farrow. Then you can use your telepathy on them, maybe, and find out what their game is." She nodded, pulled the car down to a mere ramble, and we swapped seats quickly. As I let the crate out again, I took one last fast dig of the landscape and located the cars that were blocking out the passageways to the south, west, and north, leaving a nice inviting hole to the easterly north way. Then I had to haul in my perception and slap it along the road ahead, because I was going to ramble far and fast and see if I could speed out of the trailing horseshoe and cut out around the South Horn with enough leeway to double back towards Homestead. "Catch any plans from them?" I asked Farrow. There was no answer. I looked at her. Gloria Farrow was semi-collapsed in her seat, her eyes closed gently and her breath coming in long, pleasant swells. I'd known she was tired, but I hadn't expected this absolute ungluing. A damned good kid, Farrow. At that last thought, Farrow moved slightly in her sleep, and a wisp of a smile crossed her lips briefly. Then she turned a bit and snuggled down in the seat and really hit the slumber path. A car came roaring at me with flashing headlamps, and I realized that dusk was coming. I didn't need the lights, but oncoming drivers did, so I snapped them on. The beams made bright tunnels in the light, and we went along and on and on and on, hour after hour. Now and then I caught a perceptive impression of the crescent of cars that were corralling us along US 67 and not letting us off the route. I hauled out my road map and eyed the pages as I drove by perception. US 67 led to St. Louis, and from there due north. I had a hunch that by the time we played hide and seek through St. Louis and got ourselves hazed out to their satisfaction, I'd be able to give a strong guess as to our ultimate destination. I settled down in my seat and just drove, still hoping to cut fast and far around them on my way to Homestead. End of chapter 22. Section 23 of Highways and Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 23. 3 times during the night I tried to flip around and cut my way through their cordon, and each time I faced interception. It was evident that we were being driven, and so long as we went to their satisfaction, they weren't going to clobber us. Nurse Farrow woke up along about dawn, stretched, and remarked that she could use a toothbrush and a tub of hot water, and amusedly berated herself for not filling the back seat before we took off. Then she became serious again and asked for the details of the night, which I slipped her as fast as I could. We stopped long enough to swap seats, and I stretched out, but I couldn't sleep. Finally I said, Stop at the next dog wagon, Pharaoh. We're gonna eat, comes anything.
Won't that be dangerous?
Shucks, I grunted angrily. They'll probably thank us. They're probably hungry too.
We'll find out.
The smell of a roadside diner is usually a bit on the thick and greasy side, but I was so hungry that morning that it smelled like Mother's kitchen. We went in, ordered coffee and orange juice, and then disappeared into the restrooms long enough to clean up. That felt so good, we ordered the works and watched the guy behind the fry plate handle the bacon, eggs, and home fries with a deft, efficient manner. We pitched in fast, hoping to beat the flies to our breakfast. We were so intent that we paid no attention to the car that came into the lot until a man came in, ordered coffee and a roll, and then carried it over to our table.
Fine day for a ride, isn't it?
I eyed him. Pharaoh bristled and got very tense. I said, I doubt that I know you, friend.
Quite likely, but I know you, Cornell.
I took a fast dig. There was no sign of anything lethal except the usual collection of tire irons, screwdrivers, and other tools which, oddly enough, seldom come through as being dangerous because they're not weapons by design.
I'm not healed, Cornell. I'm just here to save us all some trouble.
Telepath? He nodded imperceptibly. Then he said,
We'll all save time, gasoline, and maybe getting into grief with the cops if you take Route 40 out of St. Louis.
Suppose I don't like US 40.
Get used to it, he said with a crooked smile. Because you'll take US 40 out of St. Louis whether you like it or not.
I returned his crooked smile. I also dug his hide, and he was a Mextrum, of course. Friend, I replied, nothing would convince me, after what you've said, that US 40 is anything but a cow path, slippery when wet and impassable in the early spring, late summer, and the third Thursday after Michaelmas. He stood up.
Cornell, I can see your point. You don't like US 40. So I'll help you, good people. If you don't want to drive along such a lousy slab of concrete, just say the word and we'll arrange for you to take it in style, luxury, and without a trace of pain or strain. I'll be seeing you, and a very pleasant trip to you, Miss Pharaoh.
Then the character got up, went to the cashier, and paid for our breakfast as well as his own. He took off in his car, and I have never seen him since. Pharaoh looked at me, her face white and her whole attitude one of fright.
US 40, she said in a shaky voice, runs like a stretched string from St. Louis to Indianapolis.
She didn't have to tell me any more. About 60 miles north of Indianapolis on Indiana State Highway 37 lies the thriving metropolis of Marion, Indiana, the most important facet of which, to Pharaoh and me, is an establishment called the Medical Research Center. Nothing was going to make me drive out of St. Louis along US 40. Period. End of message. No answer required. Nothing, because I was very well aware of their need to collect me alive and kicking. If I could not roar out of St. Louis in the direction I selected, I was going to turn my car end for end and have at them. Not in any mild manner, but with deadly intent to do deadly damage. If I'd make a mild pass, they'd undoubtedly corral me by main force and carry me off kicking and screaming. But if I went at them to kill or get killed, they'd have to move aside just to prevent me from killing myself. I didn't think I'd get to the last final blow of that self-destruction. I'd win through. So we left the diner after breakfast on our enemy's expense account and took off again. I was counting on St. Louis. The center of the old city is one big, shapeless blob of a dead area, so nice and cold that St. Louis has reversed the usual city-type blight area growth. Ever since Rhine, the slum sections have been moving out and the new buildings have been moving in. So, with the dead area and the brand-new wide streets and fancy traffic control, St. Louis was the place to go in along one road, get lost in traffic, and come out, roaring along any road desirable. I could not believe that any outfit, hoping to work undercover, could collect enough manpower and cars to block every road, lane, highway, and duck runway that led out of a city as big as St. Louis. Again they hazed us by pacing along parallel roads and behind us, with the open end of their crescent aimed along US 67. We went like hell. Without slowing a bit, we sort of swooped up to St. Louis and took a fast dive into that big blob-shaped dead area. We wound up in traffic and tied Boy Scout knots in our course. I was concerned about overhead coverage from a copter, even though I've been told that the St. Louis dead area extends upward in some places as high as 13,000 feet. The only thing missing was some device or doodad that would let us use our perception or telepathy in this deadness while they couldn't. As it was, we were as psi-blind as they were, so we had to go along the streets with our eyes carefully peeled for cars of questionable ownership. We saw some passenger cars with out-of-state licenses and gave them wide clearances. One of them hung on our tail until I committed a very neat coup by running through a stoplight and sandwiching my car between two whopping big 14-wheel moving vans. I'd have enjoyed the expression on the driver's face if I could have seen it, but then we were gone and he was probably cussing. I stayed between the vans as we wound ourselves along the road and turned into a side street. I stayed between them too long, because the guy in front slammed on his air brakes and the big van came to a stop with a howl of tires on concrete. The guy behind did not even slow down. He closed in on us like an avalanche. I took a fast look around and fought the wheel of my car to turn aside, but he wailed into my tail and we went sliding forward. I was riding my brakes, but the mass of that moving van was so great that my tires just wore flats on the pavement side. We were bearing down on that stopped van, and it looked as though we were going to be driving a very tall car with a very short wheelbase in a very short time. Then the whole back panel of the front van came tumbling towards me from the top, pivoting on a hinge at the bottom, making a fine ramp. The van behind me nudged us up the ramp, and we hurtled forward against a thick, resilient pad that stopped my car without any damage either to the car or to the inhabitants. Then the back panel closed up, and the van took off. Two big birds on each side opened the doors of our car simultaneously and said, "Out." The tall guy on my side gave me a cocksure smile, and the short guy said, "We're about to leave St. Louis on US 40, Cornell. I hope you won't find this journey too rough." I started to take a swing, but the tall one caught my elbow and threw me off balance. The short one reached down and picked up a baseball bat. "Use this, Cornell," he told me. "Then no one will get hurt." I looked at the pair of them, and then gave up. There are odd characters in this world who actually enjoy physical combat and don't mind getting hurt if they can hurt the other guy more. These were the type. Taking that baseball bat and busting it over the head of either one would be the same sort of act as kids use when they square off in an alley and exchange light blows which they call a cardie, just to make the fight legal. All it would get me was a sore jaw and a few cracked ribs. So, after my determination to take after them with murderous intent, they'd pulled my teeth by scooping me up in this van and disarming me. I relaxed. The short one nodded, although he looked disappointed that I hadn't allowed him the fun of a shindy. "You'll find US 40 less rough than you expected," he said. "After all, it's like life, only rough if you make it rough." "Go to hell and stay there," I snapped. That was about as weak a rejoinder as I've ever emitted, but it was all I could get out. The tall one said, "Take it easy, Cornell. You can't win 'em all." I looked across the nose of our trapped car to Farrow. She was leaning against the hood, facing her pair. They were just standing there at ease. One of them was offering a cigarette, and the other held a lighter ready. "Relax," said the one with the smokes. The other one said, "Might as well, Miss Farrow. Fighting won't get nobody nowhere but where you're going anyway. Might as well go on your own feet." Scornfully, Farrow shrugged.
"Why should I smoke my own?"
she asked nobody in particular. Mentally, I agreed. "Take 'em for all they're worth, Farrow." And then I reached for one, too. Along the side of the van were benches. I sat down, stretched out my back, and let the smoke trickle up. I finished my cigarette and then found that the excitement of this chase, having died so abruptly, left me with only a desire to catch up on sleep. I dozed off, thinking that it wasn't everybody who started off to go to Homestead, Texas, and ended up in Marion, Indiana. Scholar Phelps did not have the green carpet out for our arrival, but he was present when our mobile prison cell opened deep inside of the medical center grounds. So was Thorndyke. Thorndyke and 3 nurses of Amazon build escorted Farrow off with the air of captors collecting a traitor. Phelps smiled superciliously at me and said, "Well, young sir, you've given us quite a chase." "Give me another chance and we'll have another chase," I told him grumpily. "Well, not if we can help it," he boomed cheerfully. "We've big plans for you." "Have I got a vote?" "It's nay if I do." "You're too precipitous," he told me. "It is always an error, Mr. Cornell, to be opinionated. Have an open mind." "To what?" "To everything," he said with an expansive gesture. "The error of all thinking these days is that people do not think. They merely follow someone else's thinking." "And I'm to follow yours?" "I'd prefer that, of course. It would indicate that you were possessed of a mind of your own, that you weren't merely taking the lazy man's attitude and following in the footsteps of your father." "Skip it," I snapped. "Your way isn't—" "No," he warned, with a wave of a forefinger like a prohibitionist warning someone not to touch that quart. "One must never form an opinion on such short notice. Remember, all ideas are not to be rejected just because they do not happen to agree with your own preconceived notions." "Look, Phelps," I snapped, deliberately omitting his title, which I knew would bite a little. "I don't like your personal politics, and I deplore your methods. You can't go on playing this way." "Young man, you err," he said quietly. He did not even look nettled that I'd addressed him in impolite, if not rough, terms. "May I point out that I am far ahead of your game? Thoroughly outnumbered and in ignorance of the counter-movement against me until you so vigorously brought it to my attention, within a year I have fought the counter-movement to a standstill, caused the disbursement of their main forces, ruined their far-flung lines of communication, and have so consolidated my position that I have now made open capture of the main roving factor. The latter is you, young man, a very disturbing influence and so very necessary to the conduct of this private war. You prate of my attitude, Mr. Cornell. You claim that such an attitude must be defeated. Yet, as you stand there mouthing platitudes, we are preparing to make a frontal assault upon their main base at Homestead. We've waged our war of attrition. A mere spearhead will break them and scatter them to the far winds." "Nice lecture," I grunted. "Who are your writers?" "Let's not attempt sarcasm," he said crisply. "It sits ill upon you, Mr. Cornell." "I'd like to sit on you," I snapped. "Your humor is less tolerable than your sarcasm." "Can it?" I snapped. "So you've collected me. I'm still—" "You'll do very little, Mr. Cornell," he told me. "Your determination to attack us tooth and nail was an excellent program, and with another type of person it might have worked. But I happen to know that your will to live is very great, young man, and that in the final blow you'd not have the will to die great enough to carry your assault to its completion." "Know a lot, don't you?" Yes, indeed I do. So now, if you're through trying to fence at words, we'll go to your quarters." "Lead on," I said in a hollow voice. With an air of stage-type politeness, he indicated a door. He showed me out and followed me. He steered me to a big limousine with a chauffeur and offered me cigarettes from a box on the armrest as the driver started the turbine. The car purred with that muted sound of well-leashed power. "You could be of inestimable value to us," he said in a conversational tone. "I am talking this way to you because you can be of much more value as a willing ally than you would be if unwilling." "No doubt," I replied dryly. "I suggest you set aside your preconceived notions and employ a modicum of practical logic," suggested Scholar Phelps. "Observe your position from a slightly different reign of vantage. Be convinced that no matter what you do or say, we intend to make use of you to the best of our ability. You are not entertaining any doubts of that fact, I'm sure." I shrugged. Phelps was not asking me these things. The Inquisitor was actually telling me. He went right on telling me, "Since you will be used no matter what, you might consider the advisability of being sensible, Mr. Cornell. In blunt words, we are prepared to meet cooperation with certain benefits which will not be proffered otherwise." "In blunter words, you are offering to hire me." Scholar Phelps smiled in a superior manner. "Not that blunt, Mr. Cornell, and not that crude. The term hire implies the performance of certain tasks in return for stipulated remuneration. No, my intention is to give you a position in this organization, the exact terms of which are not clearly definable. Look, young man, I've indicated that your willing cooperation is more valuable to us than otherwise. Join us, and you will enjoy the freedom of our most valued and trusted members. You will take part in upper-level planning. You will enjoy the income and advantages of top executive personnel." He stopped short and eyed me with a peculiar expression. "Mr. Cornell, you have the most disconcerting way. You've actually caused me to talk as if this organization were some sort of big business instead of a cultural unit." I eyed him with the first bit of humor I'd found in many days. "You seem to talk just as though a cultural unit were set above, beyond, and spiritually divorced from anything so sordid as money, position, and the human equivalent of the barnyard pecking order," I told him. "So now let's stop goofing off and put it into simple terms. You want me to join you willingly, to do your job for you, to advance your program, in return for which I shall be permitted to ride in the solid gold Cadillac, quaff rare champagne, and select my own office furniture. Is that about it?" Scholar Phelps smiled, using a benign expression that indicated that he was pleased with himself, but which had absolutely nothing to do with his attitude towards me or any of the rest of the human race. "Mr. Cornell, I am well aware of the time it may take for a man to effect a change in his attitude. In fact, I would be very suspicious if you were to make an abrupt reversal. However, I have outlined my position to you, and you may have time to think it over. Consider, at the very least, the fact that while cooperation will bring you pleasure and non-cooperation will bring you pain, the ultimate result will be that we will make use of your ability in either case. Now, I will say no more for the present." The limousine had stopped in front of a 4-story brick building that was only slightly different in general architecture than the others in the medical center. I could sense some slight difference, but when I took a dig at the interior, I found to my amazement that this building had been built deliberately in a dead zone. The dead area stood up in the clarity like a little blob of black ink at the bottom of a crystal-clear swimming pool, seen just before the ink began to diffuse. Scholar Phelps saw my look of puzzlement and said suavely, "We've reversed the usual method of keeping unwilling guests. Here we know their frame of mind and attitude. Therefore, to build the place in a dead area keeps them from plotting among themselves. I trust that your residence herein will be only temporary, Mr. Cornell." I nodded glumly. I was facing those last and final words, or else. Phelps signed a register at the guard station in the lobby. We took a very fast and efficient elevator to the 3rd floor, and Phelps escorted me along a hallway that was lined with doors, dormitory style. In the eye-level center of each door was a bullseye that looked like one-way glass, and undoubtedly was. I itched to take a look, but Phelps was not having any. He stopped my single step with a hand on my arm. "This way," he said smoothly. I went this way and was finally shown into one of the rooms. My nice, clean cell away from home. End of chapter 23. Section 24 of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 24. As soon as Phelps was gone, I took a careful look at my new living quarters. The room itself was about 14 by 18, but the end in which I was confined was only 14 by 10, the other 8 feet of end being barred off by a very efficient-looking set of heavy metal rods and equally strong cross-girding. There was a sliding door that fit in place as nicely as the door to a bank vault. It was locked by heavy keeper bars that slid up from the floor and down from the ceiling, and they were actuated by hidden motors. In the barrier was a flat, horizontal slot wide enough to take a tray and high enough to pass a teacup. The bottom of this slot was flush with a small table that extended through the barrier by a couple of feet on both sides, so that a tray could be set down on the outside and slipped in. I tested the bars with my hands, but even my new set of muscles wouldn't flex them more than a few thousandths of an inch. The walls were steel. All I got as I tried them was a set of paint-clogged fingernails. The floor was also steel. The ceiling was a bit too high for me to tackle, but I assumed that it, too, was steel. The window was barred from the inside, undoubtedly so that any visitor from the outside could not catch on to the fact that this building was a private calaboose. The furnishings of this cold storage bin were meager of minimum requirements. A washstand and a toilet. A bunk made of metal girders welded to the floor. The bedding rested on wide, resilient straps fixed to the crossbars at top and bottom of the bed. A foam rubber mattress, sheets, and one blanket finished off the bed. It was a cell designed by Meckstroms to contain Meckstroms, and by wiseacres to contain other wiseacres. The non-metallic parts of the room were, of course, fireproof. Anything I could get hold of was totally useless as a weapon or lever or tool. Anything that might have been useful to a prisoner was welded down. Having given up in the escape department, I sat on my bunk and lit a cigarette. I looked for telltales and found a television lens set above the door of the room 8 feet outside of my steel barrier. Beside the lens was a speaker grill and a smaller opening that looked like a microphone dust cover. With a grunt, I flipped my cigarette at the television lens. I hit just above the hole, missing it by about an inch. Immediately, a tinny-sounding voice said, "That is not permitted, Mr. Cornell. You are expected to maintain some degree of personal cleanliness. Since you cannot pick up that cigarette butt, you have placed an unwelcome task upon our personnel. One more infraction of this nature, and you will not be permitted the luxury of smoking." "Go to the devil," I snapped. There was no reply, not even a haughty chuckle. The silence was worse than any reply because it pointed out the absolute superiority of their position. Eventually, I dozed off, there being nothing else to do. When I awoke, they'd shoved a tray of food in on my table. I ate unenthusiastically. I dozed again, during which time someone removed the tray. When I woke up the second time, it was night and time to go to bed, so I went. I woke up in the morning to see a burly guy enter with a tray of breakfast. I attempted to engage him in light conversation, but he did not even let on that I was in the cell. Later, he removed the tray as silently as he'd brought it, and I was left with another 4 hours of utter boredom until the same bird returned with a light lunch. 6 hours after lunch came a slightly more substantial dinner, but no talk. By bedtime the second night, I was getting stir-crazy. I hit the sack about 9:30 and tossed and turned, unable to drop off because I was not actually tired. I was also wondering when they'd come around with their brainwashing crew, or maybe someone who'd enter with an ultimatum. On the following morning, the tray bearer was Dr. Thorndyke, who sat on the chair on the outside of my bars and looked at me silently. I tried giving him stare for stare, but eventually I gave up and said, "So now where do we go?" "Cornell, you're in a bad spot of your own making." "Could be," I admitted. "And yet, really, you're more of a victim of circumstances." "Forget all the side play. I'm a prisoner," I told him curtly. "Let's face a few facts, Thorndyke, and stop tossing this guff." "All right," he said shortly. "The facts are these. We would prefer that you help us willingly. We'd further prefer to have you as you are, that is, unreoriented mentally." "You couldn't afford to trust me," I grunted. "Maybe we can. It's no secret that we've latched onto quite a number of your friends. Let's assume that they will all be well treated, if you agree to join us willingly." "I'm sure that the attitude of any of my friends is such that they'd prefer me to stand my ground rather than betray their notions of right and wrong," I told him. "That's a foolish premise," he replied. "You could no more prevail against us than you could single-handedly overthrow the government. Having faced that fact, it becomes sound and sensible to accept the premise and then see what sort of niche you can carve out of the new order." "I don't like your new order," I grunted. "Many people will not," he admitted. "But then people do not really know what's good for them." I almost laughed at him. "Look," I said, "I'd rather make my own ignorant mistakes than to have some great father supervise my life. And speaking of fathers, we've both got to admit that God himself permits us the complete freedom of our wills." Thorndyke sneered at me. "If we're to quote scripture," he said sourly, "I'll point out that the Lord thy God is a jealous God, visiting his wrath even upon 7 generations of those who hate him." "Granted," I replied calmly, "but whether we love him or hate him is entirely up to our particular notion. Now, Cornell, stop talking like an idiot. Here, too, you can take your choice. I'm not ordering you. I'm just trying to point out that whether you go on suffering or enjoying life is entirely up to your own decision. And also your decision will help or hinder others." "You're entirely too godlike," I told him. "Well," he said, "think it over." "Go to the devil." "Now, that's a very weak response," he said loftily, "doing nobody any good or harm. Just talk. So stop gabbing and think." Thorndyke left me with my thoughts. Sure, I had bargaining power, but it was no good. I'd be useful only until they discovered some method of inoculating normal flesh with Mekstrom's disease, and once that was taken care of, Steve Cornell would be a burden upon their resources. So that was the morning of my 3rd day of incarceration, and nothing more took place all day. They didn't even give me anything to read, and I almost went nuts. You have no idea of how long 14 hours can be until you've been sitting in a cell with absolutely nothing to do. I exercised by chinning myself on the bars and playing gymnastics. I wanted to run, but there was not enough room. The physical thrill I got out of being able to chin myself with one hand wore off after a 100 pull-ups because it was no great feat for a Mekstrom. I did push-ups and bridges and other stunts until I was bored again. And all the while, my thinking section was going around and around. The one main point that I kept coming back to was a very unpleasant future to face. It was certain that no matter what I did, nor how I argued, I was going to help them out. Either I would do it willingly, or they'd grow tired of the lecture routine and take me in for a mental reevaluation, after which, being not Steve Cornell anymore, I'd join their ranks and do their bidding. About the only thing I could look at with self-confidence was my determination to hold out. If I was going to join them, it would be after I were no longer the man I am, but reoriented into whatever design they wanted. And that resolve was weakened by the normal human will to live. You can't make a horse drink water, but you can lead a human being to a well, and he will drink it dry if you keep a shotgun pointed in his direction. And so it ended up with my always wondering if, when the cards were all dealt out face up, whether I would have the guts to keep on saying no right up to the point where I walked into their department of brainwashing. In fact, I was rather afraid that in the last moment I'd weaken, just to stay being me. That uncertainty of mine was, of course, just the idea they wanted to nourish in my mind. They were doing it by leaving me alone with my mental merry-go-round. Again I hit the sack out of sheer boredom, and I turned and tossed for what seemed like hours before I dropped off to sleep, wondering and dreaming about who was to be the next visitor with a bill of goods to sell. The next visitor came in about midnight or thereabouts. I woke up with the realization that someone had come in through the outer door and was standing there in the semi-dark caused by a bright moon shining in through my barred window.
"Steve,"
she said in a near whisper. "Go away," I told her. "Haven't you done enough already?"
"Oh, please, Steve. I've got to talk to you."
I sat on the edge of my bunk and looked at her. She was fully dressed. Her light printed silk was of the same general pattern and fit that she preferred. In fact, Catherine looked as I'd always seen her, and as I'd pictured her during the long, hopeless weeks of our separation. "You got something to add?" I asked her coldly.
"I've got to make you understand, Steve,"
she pleaded. "Understand what?" I snapped. "I know already. You deliberately set out to marry, or else how tie some emotional cable onto me. God knows that you succeeded. If it hadn't been for that accident, I'd have been nailed down tight."
"That part is true,"
she whispered. "Naturally, you've got justification."
"Well, I have."
"So is any burglar." She shook her head at me.
"Steve, you don't really understand. If only you could read my mind and know the truth."
She let this trail off in a helpless awkwardness. It was one of those statements that are meaningless because it can be said by either friend or foe and cannot be checked. I just looked at her and suddenly remembered something. This was the first time in my life that I was in a position to do some verbal fencing with a telepath on even terms. I could say yes and think no with absolute impunity. In fact, I might even have had an edge, since as a poor non-telepath, I did have some training in subterfuge, falsehood, and diplomatic maneuver that the telepath couldn't have. Catherine and I, at long last, were in the position of the so-called good old days when boys and girls couldn't really know the truth about one another's real thoughts. "So what's this truth?" I demanded.
"Steve, answer me truly. Have you ever been put on an odious job only to find out that the job is really pleasant?"
"Yes."
"Then hear me out. In fact, no woman, takes kindly to being directed to do what I did. I was told to meet you, to marry—"
Her face looked flustered, and it might have been a bit flushed for all I knew. I couldn't see color enough in the dim light to be sure.
"And then I met you, Steve, and I found out that you were really a very nice sort of guy."
"Well, thanks."
"Don't be bitter. Hear the truth. If Otto Mekstrom had not existed, if there were no such thing as Mekstrom's disease, and I had met you freely and openly as men and women meet, I'd have come to feel the same, Steve. I must make you understand that my emotional attachment to you was not increased or decreased by the fact that my physical actions were directed at you. If anything, my job was just rendered pleasantly easier."
I grunted. And so you were made happy,
Yes,
she whispered.
and I was going to marry you and live honestly with you?
Heck of a marriage with the wife in the medical center for Mekstrom's disease and our first child.
Steve, you poor fool, don't you understand? If our child came as predicted, the first thing I'd do would be to have the child inoculate the father. Then we'd be—
I grunted. I hadn't thought of that. This was a flat lie. I'd considered it a plenty since my jailing here. Present the medical center with a child, a Mekstrom and a carrier, and good old Pappy would be no longer needed.
Well, after I found out all about you, Steve, that's what I had in mind. But now—
Now what? I urged her gently. I had a hunch that she was leading up to something, but ducking shy about it until she managed to find out how I thought. It would have been all zero if we'd been in a clear area, but as it was, I led her gently on.
But now I've failed,
she said with a slight wail. What do they do with failures? I asked harshly. Siberia, or a gunny sack weighted down with an anvil? Or do they drum you out of the core?
I don't know.
I eyed her closely. I was forced to admit that no matter how Catherine thought, she was a mighty attractive dish from the physical standpoint, and regardless of the trouble she'd put me through, I could not overlook the fact that I had been deeply enough in love to plan elopement and marriage. I'd held her slender body close, and either her response had been honestly warm, or Catherine was an actress of very rare physical ability. Scholar Phelps could hardly have picked a warmer temptress in the first place. Putting her onto me now was a stroke of near genius. I got up from the edge of my bunk and faced her through my bars. She came close too, and we looked into each other's faces over a cross rail of the heavy fence. I managed a wistful grin at her. You're not really a failure yet, are you, kid?
I don't quite know how to,
she replied. I looked around my little cell with a gruesome gesture. This isn't my idea of a pleasant home, and yet it will be my home until someone decides that I'm too expensive to keep.
I know,
she breathed. Taking the bit in my teeth, I said, Catherine, even though, well, heck, I'd like to help you.
You mean that?
She asked in almost an eager voice. It's not impossible to forget that we were eloping when all this started.
It all seems so long ago,
she said with a thick voice.
And I wish we were back there. No, Steve, I wish Mekstrom's disease had never happened. I wish—
Stop wishing and think, I told her half humorously. If there were no Mekstrom's disease, the chances are that we'd never have met in the first place.
That's the cruel part of it all,
she cried. And I mean cried. I rapped on the metal bars with a fist. So here we are, I said unhappily. I can't help you now, Catherine. She put her hands through the bars and held my face between them. She looked searching into my eyes as if straining to force her blocked telepath sense through the deadness of the area. She leaned against the steel, but the barrier was very effective. Our lips met through the cold metal. It was a very unsatisfactory kiss because we had to purse our lips like a pair of piccolo players to make them meet. It was like making love through a keyhole. This unsatisfactory lovemaking did not last long. Unsteadily, Catherine said,
I want you, Steve.
Inwardly, I grinned. And then, with the same feeling as if I'd laughed out loud at a funeral, I said, Through these steel bars? She brought out a little cylindrical key, then went to a brass wall plate beside the outer door, inserted the key, and turned. The sliding door to my cell opened on noiseless machine slides. Then, with a careful look at me, Catherine slipped a little shutter over the glass bullseye in the door. Her hand reached up to a hidden toggle above the door, and as she snapped it, A thick cover surged out above the speaker, television lens, and microphone grill, curved down and shut off the telltales with a cushioned sound. Apparently, the top management of the joint used these cells for other things than mere containment of unruly prisoners. I almost grinned. The society that Scholar Phelps proposed was not the kind that flourished in an atmosphere of trust or privacy, except for the top brass. Catherine turned from her switch plate and came across the floor with her face lifted and her lips parted.
"Hold me, Steve."
My hand came forward in a short jab that caught her dead center in the plexus below the ribs. Her breath caught in one strangled gasp, and her eyes went glassy. She swayed stiffly in half paralysis. My other hand came up, closing as it rose, until it became a fist that connected in a shoulder-jarring wallop on the side of her jaw. Her head snapped up and her knees caved in. She folded from the hips and went down bonelessly. From her throat came the bubbly sound of air being forced painfully through a flaccid, wet tube. I jumped outside of the cell barrier because I was certain that they had some means of closing the cell from a master control center. I don't know that much about penology, but that's the way I'd do it. I was half surprised that I'd been able to get away with this much. Catherine stirred and moaned, and I stopped long enough to take the key out of the wall plate. The cell door closed on its silent slides. I had hardly been able to more than run the zipper up my shirt when the door opened and I had to dance like a fool to get behind it. The door admitted a flood of bright light from the corridor and Dr. James Thorndyke. The cell door must have been bugged. Thorndyke came in behind a large automatic clutched in one nervous fist. He strained his eyes at the gloom that was not cut by the ribbon of light. And then I cut him down with a solid slice of my right hand to the base of his neck. I remembered to jump off the ground as the blow went home. There was a sickening crunch of bone and muscle as Thorndyke caved forward to the floor. He dropped the gun, luckily, as his body began to twitch and kick spasmodically as the life drained out of him. I re-swallowed a mouthful of bitter bile as I reached down to pick up his gun. Then the room got hot and unbearably small, and I felt a frantic urge to leave, to close the door upon that sight.
End of chapter 24.
Section 25 of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. I was yards away from my door before my panic left me. Then I remembered where and who I was and took a fast look around. There was no one else in the corridor, of course, or I would not have been able to cut and run as I had. But I looked around anyway until my reasoning power told me that I had done little to help my position. Like the canary, my plans for escape ended once I was outside of my cage. I literally did not know what to do with my newfound freedom. One thing was becoming painfully obvious. I'd be pinned down tight once I put a foot outside of the dead area in which this building was constructed. What I needed was friends, arms, ammunition, and a good solid plan of escape. I had neither, unless you call my jailed friends such help, and there I could not go. The Telltales would give me away to the Master Control Center before I could raise my small and unarmed army. So I stood there in the brightly lighted corridor and tried to think. I got nowhere, but I was driven to action again by the unmistakable sound of the elevator at the end of the corridor. I eyed the various cell doors with suspicion. Opening any but an empty room would cause some comment from the occupant, which again would give me away. Nor did I have time to canvass the joint by peeking into the one-way bullseyes, peering into a semi-gloom to see which room was empty. So instead of hiding in the corridor, I sloped towards the elevator and the stairwell that surrounded it, hoping that I could make it before the elevator rose to my floor. I know that my passage must have sounded like a turbojet in full flight, But I made the stairway and took a headlong leap down the first short flight of stairs just as the elevator door rolled open. I hit the wall with a bumping crash that jarred my senses, but I kept my feet and looked back up the stairs. I caught a flash of motion. A guard sauntering past the top of the well, a cigarette in one hand and a lazy-looking air about him. He was expecting no trouble, so I gave him none. I crept up the stairs and poked my head out just at the floor level. The guard, obviously confident that nothing but nothing could ever happen in this welded metal crib, jauntily peered into a couple of the rooms at random, took a long squint at the room I'd recently vacated, and then went on to the end of the hall where he stuck a key in a signal box. On his way back, he paused again to peer into my room, straining to see if he could peer past the little shutter over the bullseye. Then he shrugged unhappily and started to return. I loped down the stairs to the second floor and waited. The elevator came down, stopped, and the guard repeated his desultory search, not stopping to pry into any darkened rooms. Just above the final first-floor flight, I stopped and sprawled on the floor with only my head and the nose of my gun over the top step. Below was the guard's desk, and standing beside the desk with anger in every line of his ugly face was Scholar Phelps. The elevator came down, stopped, and the guard walked out to be nailed by Phelps. "Your job," snapped the good scholar coldly, "says you are to walk." "Well, sir, it's—" "Walk," stormed Phelps angrily. "You can't cover that stairway in the elevator, you fumbling idiot." "But, sir—" "Someone could easily come down while you go up." "I know that, sir, but—" "Then why do you disobey?" roared Phelps. "Well, you see, sir, I know how this place is built, and no one has ever made it yet. Who could?" The guard looked mystified. Phelps had to face that fact. He did not accept it gracefully. "My orders are orders," he said stiffly. "You'll follow them, to the last letter." "Yes, sir, I will." "See that you do. Now I'm going up. I'll ride and you walk. Meet me on the 4th floor and bring the elevator down with you." "Yes, sir." I sloped upstairs like a scared rabbit, up to the 3rd again, where I moved down the corridor and slipped into the much too thin niche made by a door. Stolidly, the guard came up the stairs, crossed in front of the elevator with his back to me, turned the far corner, and went on up to the 4th. As his feet started up the stairs, I was behind him. By the time he reached the top, I was halfway up. Phelps said, "Now, from this moment on, Waldron, you'll follow every order to the absolute letter. And when I ring, don't make the error of bringing the elevator. Send it. It'll come up and stop without a pilot." "Yes, sir. I'm sorry, sir. But you understand, sir, there isn't really much to guard, sir." "Then guard nothing. But guard it well, because a man in your position is gauged in success by the amount of boredom he creates for himself." The guard started down, and I darted up to poke my head out to see where Phelps was going. As I neared the floor level, I had a shock, like someone hurling 20 gallons of ice water in my face. The top floor was the end of the dead area, and I pulled my head down into the murk like a diver taking a plunge. So I stood there, making like a guppy, with my head sounding out the boundary of that deadness, ducking down as soon as the mental murk gave me a faint perception of the wall and ceiling above me. Then I'd move aside and sound it again. Eventually, I found a little billowing furrow that rose above the floor level, and I crawled out along the floor, still sounding and moving cautiously with my body hidden in the deadness that rose and fell like a cloud of murky mental smoke to my sense of perception. I would have looked silly to any witness, wallowing along the floor like a porpoise acting furtive in the bright lights. But then I couldn't go any farther. The deadness sank below the floor level and left me looking along a bare floor that was also bare to my sense of perception. I shoved my head out of the dead zone and took a fast dig. then dropped back in again and lay there reconstructing what I'd perceived mentally. I did it the second time and the third, each time making a rapid scan of some portion of that fourth floor. In 3 fast swings, I collected a couple of empty offices, a very complete hospital set-up operating room, and a place that looked like a consultation theater. On my fourth scan, I whipped past Scholar Phelps, who was apparently deep in some personal interest. I rose at once and strode down the hall and snapped the door open just as Phelps' completely unexpecting mind grasped the perceptive fact that someone was coming down his hallway wearing a great big .45 automatic. "Freeze!" I snapped. "Put that weapon down, Mr. Cornell. It nor its use will get your freedom." "Maybe all I want out of life is to see you leave it," I told him. "You'd not be that foolish, I'm sure," he said. "I might." He laughed with all the self-confidence in the world. "Mr. Cornell, you have too much will to live. You're not the martyr type." "I might turn out to be the cornered rat type," I told him seriously. "So play it cagey, Phelps." "Scholar Phelps, please." "I wouldn't disgrace the medical profession," I told him. So what do you propose to do about this?" "I'm getting out." "Don't be ridiculous. One step out of this building and you'll return within a half-minute. How did you get out?" "I was seduced out." "Now, I'd advise you to surrender, to stop this hopeless attempt, to put that weapon down. You cannot escape. There are, in this building, your mental and intellectual superiors whose incarceration bear me witness." I eyed him coldly and quietly. "I'm not convinced. I'm out. And if you could take a dig below, you'd see a dead man and an unconscious woman to bear me witness. I broke your Dr. Thorndyke's neck with a chop of my bare hand, Phelps. I knocked Catherine cold with a fist. This thing might not kill you, but I'm a Mextrum too, and so help me I can cool you down but good." "Violence will get you nothing." "Try my patience. I'll bet my worthless hide on it." Then I grinned at him. "Oh, it isn't so worthless, is it?" "One cry from me, Mr. Cornell, and you'll not live to see what happens. I've killed once tonight. I didn't like it. But the idea is not as new now as it was then. I'll kill you, Phelps, if for no other reason than merely to keep my word." With a sneer, Phelps turned to his desk and I stabbed my perception behind the papers and stuff to the call button. Then I launched myself across the room like a rocket, swinging my gun hand as I soared. The steel caught him on the side of the head and drove him back from his call button before his finger could press it. Then I let him have a fist in the belly because the pistol swat hadn't much more than dazed him. The fist did it. He crumpled in a heap and fought for breath unconsciously. I turned to the wall he'd been eyeing with so much attention. There was row upon row of small kidney tubes, each showing the dark interior of a cell. Below each was a row of pilot lights, all dark. On his desk was a large bank of push-buttons, a speaker, and a microphone. And beside the push-button setup was a ledger containing a list of names with their cell numbers. I found Marion Harrison, pushed her button, and heard her ladylike snore from the speaker. A green lamp winked under one of the kidney tubes, and I walked over and looked into the darkened cell to see her familiar hair sprawled over a thick pillow. I went to the desk and snapped on the microphone. "Marion," I said. "Marion! Hey, Marion Harrison!" In the picture tube there was a stir. Then she sat up and looked around in a sort of daze. "Marion, this is Steve Cornell, but don't—" "Steve!" "Cry out," I finished uselessly. "Where are you?" she asked in a whisper. "I'm in the con room." "But how on earth—" "No time to gab. I'll be down in a rush with the key. Get dressed." "Yes, Steve." I took off in a headlong rush with the hotel register in one hand. I made the third floor and Marion's cell in slightly more than nothing flat, but she was ready when I came barging into her room. She was out of the cell before it hit the backstop and following me down the hall towards her brother's room. "What happened?" she asked breathlessly. "Later," I told her. I opened Philip Harrison's cell. "You go wake up Fred Macklin and tell him to come here. Then get the Macklin girl, Alice it says here, and the pair of you wake up others and start sending 'em upstairs. I'll call you on the telltale as soon as I can." Marion took off with the key and the register, and I started to shake Philip Harrison's shoulder. "Wake up," I cried. "Wake up, Philip." Philip made a noise like a baby seal. "Wake up." "What?" "It's Steve Cornell. Wake up." With a rough shake of his head, Philip groaned and unwound himself out of a tangle of bedclothing. He looked at me through half-closed glassy eyes. Then he straightened and made a perilous course to the washstand where he sopped a towel in cold water and applied it to his face, neck, and shoulders. When he dropped the towel in the sink, his expression was fresher and his eyes were mingled curiosity and amazement. "What gives?" he asked, starting to dress in a hurry. I busted out, slugged Scholar Phelps, and took over the master control room. "I need help. We can't keep it long unless we move fast." "Yeah, man, any moving will be fast," he said sourly. "Got any plans?" The door opened to let Fred Macklin enter. He carried his shirt and had been dressing on the run. "What goes on?" he asked. "Look," I said quickly. "If I have to stop and give anybody a rundown, we'll have no time to do what has to be done. There are a couple of sources of danger. One is the guard down at the bottom of the stairway. The other is the possible visitor. You get a couple of other young, ambitious fellows and push that guard post over, but quick." "Right. And you?" "I've got to keep our hostage cold," I snapped. "And I'm running the show by virtue of being the guy that managed to bust loose." In the hallway there was movement, but I left it to head back to Scholar Phelps. I got there in time to hear him groan and make scratching noises on the carpet. I took no chances. I cooled him down with a short jab to the pit of the stomach and doubled him over again. He was sleeping painfully but soundlessly when Marion came in. I turned to her. "You're supposed to be waking up." "I gave the key and the register to Joanne Tweedy," she said. "Joanne's the brash young teenager you took a bump with in Ohio. She's competent, Steve, and she's got the Macklin twins to help her. Waking up the camp is a job for the junior division." She eyed the recumbent Phelps distastefully. "What have you in mind for him?" "He's valuable," I said. "We'll use him to buy our freedom." The door opened again, interrupting Marion. It was Jonas Harrison. He stood there in the frame of the door and looked at us with a sort of grim smile. I had never met the old patriarch of the Harrison family before, but he lived up to my every expectation. He stood tall and straight, topped by a wealth of snow-white hair, white eyebrows, and the touch of a white mustache. His eyes contrasted with the white, a rich and startling brown. This was a man to whom I could hand the basic problem of engineering our final escape. Jonas Harrison was capable of plotting an airtight getaway. His voice was rich and resonant. It had a lift in its tone that sounded as though his self-confidence had never been in danger of a setback. "Well, son, you seem to have accomplished quite a job this night. What shall we do next?" "Get the devil out of here," I replied, wondering just exactly how I'd known so instantly that this was Jonas Harrison. The rich and resonant voice had flicked a subsurface recollection on a faint, raw spot, and now something important was swimming around in the mire of my mind, trying to break loose and come clear. I turned from the sword-sharp brown eyes and looked at Marion. She was almost as I had first seen her. Not much makeup, if any at all. Her hair free of fancy dressing, but neat. Her legs were bare and healthy tanned. I looked at her, and for a half-dozen heartbeats, her image faded from my sight.
replaced by the well-remembered figure of Catherine as I had known her first. It was a dizzy-making montage because my perception senses the real figure of Marion, superimposed on the visual memory image of Catherine. Then the false sight faded, and both perception and eyesight focused upon the true person of Marion Harrison. Marion stood there, her face softly proud. Her eyes were looking straight into mine, as if she were mentally urging me to fight that hidden memory into full recollection. Then I both saw and perceived something that I had never noticed before. A fine golden chain hung around her throat, its pendant hidden from sight beneath the edge of her bodice. But my sense of perception dug a modest diamond, and I could even dig the tiny initials engraved in the metal circlet. S.C.M.H. To dig anything that fine, I knew that it must be of importance to me. And then I knew that it had once been so very personally my own business, for the submerged recollection came bursting up to the top of my mind. Marion Harrison had been mine once, long ago. Boldly I stepped forward and took the chain between my fingers. I snapped it and held the ring. "Will you wear it again, my dear?" She held up her left hand for me to slip it on. "Steve," she breathed, "I've never stopped wearing it. Not really." But I didn't see it until now. Jonas Harrison said, "No, Steve, you couldn't see it until you remembered." "But look." "Blame me," he said in his firm, determined voice. "The story begins and ends with you, Steve. When Marion contracted Mekstrom's disease, she herself insisted that you be spared the emotional pain that the rest of us could not avoid. So I erased her from your mind, Steve, and submerged any former association. Then, when the highways in hiding came to take us in, I left it that way because Marion was still as unattainable to you as if she were dead. If an apology is needed, I'll only ask that you forgive my tampering with your mind and personality." "Apologize?" I exploded. "I'm here. We're here. And you've just provided me with a way out of this mousetrap." A way out," he murmured, in that absent way that telepaths have when they're concentrating on another mind. Fast comprehension dawned in the sharp brown eyes, and he looked even more self-confident and determined. Marion leaned back in my arms to look into my eyes. "Steve," she cried, "it's simply got to work." Gloria Farrow merely said, "He'll have to have medication, of course," and went briskly to a wall cabinet and began to fiddle with the medical tools. Howard Macklin and Jonas Harrison went into a deep telepathic conference that was interrupted only when Jonas Harrison turned to Philip to say, "You'll have to provide us with uninterrupted time somehow." Marion disengaged herself reluctantly and started to propel me out of the room. "Go help him, Steve. What we are going to do is not for any non-telepath to watch." Outside, Philip threatened me with a guard's signal box key. "Mind telling a non-telepath what the devil you cooked up?" I smiled. "If your father has the mental power to erase Marion from my mind, he also has the power to do a fine reorientation job on Scholar Phelps. Once we get the spider webs cleaned out of the top dog, we start down the pyramid, line by line and echelon by echelon, with each reoriented recruit adding to our force. Once we get this joint operating on the level, we can all go to work for the rest of the human race." There is little left to tell. The medical center and the highways in hiding are one agency, dedicated to the conquest of the last and most puzzling of the diseases and maladies that beset mankind. We are no closer to a solution than we ever were, and so I am still a very busy man. I have written this account and disclosed our secret because we want no more victims of Mekstrom's disease to suffer. So I will write finish with one earnest plea and one ray of hope.
Please do not follow one of our highways unless you are already infected. Since I cannot hope to inoculate the entire human race, and will not pick or choose certain worthy types for special attention, I will deal only with those folks who find Mekstrom's disease among their immediate family. Such people need never be parted from their loved ones. The rest of you will have to wait your turn. But we'll get to it sooner or later. 30 days ago, Steve Jr. was born. He's a healthy little Mekstrom, and like his pappy, Steve Jr. is a carrier too.
End of chapter 25.
End of Highways in Hiding by George O. Smith.